The atmospheric transition was not a smooth glide, but a violent, rhythmic percussion against the hull of the heavy-lift transport, a sound like a million hammers striking a resonant anvil in a vacuum. Pilot Commander Vane Kestrel did not look at the vibrating readouts. He felt the integrity of the ship through the soles of his boots and the tension in the hydraulic flight stick. To the xylophite observers strapped into the secondary jump seats, this descent was a terrifying violation of orbital mechanics, a crude and dangerous wrestling match with gravity that no civilized species would ever attempt. The xylophytes preferred elegant gravity nullification fields that whispered through the thermosphere, but humanity had built the Indomitable out of reinforced carbon steel and stubbornness, because gravity nullification was a luxury they had never been invited to share. Vane could hear the screech of the heat shielding ablating away, a smell of ozone and scorched ceramic filling the cockpit as the friction turned the outer skin of the vessel into a white-hot husk. He tightened his grip, his knuckles white against the dark polymer of the controls, and nudged the thrusters just enough to keep the nose from shearing off. He knew the xylophytes were watching him with their multifaceted eyes, likely calculating the exact millisecond of their impending demise, but Vane wasn't planning on dying today. He was too annoyed for martyrdom. The mission was simple: extract the stranded diplomatic core from the surface of the tectonic unstable moon before the volcanic vents turned the entire atmosphere into a sulfurous soup. The xylophytes had abandoned their own people hours ago, citing the high probability of structural failure in their delicate glass-bottomed cruisers, but they had underestimated the human capacity for operating machinery that was technically screaming in agony. As the Indomitable punched through the cloud layer, the landscape of the moon revealed itself as a jagged, obsidian nightmare. Geysers of molten silicate erupted in the distance, casting a hellish orange glow over the jagged mountain ranges that looked like the teeth of some prehistoric predator. Vane adjusted the trim, the heavy ship groaning as it fought the erratic crosswinds generated by the thermal updrafts. The xylophyte coordinator, a spindly creature named Teethok, chattered a series of frantic clicks through the translator, complaining that the vibration was crystalline fracturing his internal resonance chambers. Vane didn't care about resonance, he cared about the landing struts. He slammed the landing gear lever down, feeling the heavy thud as the massive pistons locked into place. The ground was rushing up far too fast for a standard approach, so he flipped the ship nearly 90 degrees, using the main engines as a makeshift brake against the gravity well. The roar was deafening, a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly into the bone marrow. The Indomitable slammed into the basalt plain with enough force to crack the bedrock, bouncing once before the magnetic anchors fired, tethering the beast to the surface. For a long moment, the only sound was the cooling of the metal, a series of pings and pops that sounded like a slow-motion rainstorm. Vane exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and unbuckled his harness, ignoring the way his hands shook. He turned to Teethok, who was trembling in his seat, and offered a grim smile that showed far too many teeth. "We are on the ground," Vane said, his voice gravelly from the G-force strain, "and we are ahead of schedule. Now, get your people moving before the ground melts under my tires." The cargo ramp hissed open, revealing a world that was actively trying to kill anything that breathed. The air was a thick, abrasive haze of ash and toxic gases, but the human rescue team was already moving out in their bulky, pressurized environment suits. These weren't the sleek, translucent suits of the higher-tier galactic species. These were heavy, lead-lined suits designed for mining in the belts, scarred by years of hard labor and orbital radiation. The humans moved with a deliberate, heavy-footed grace, their magnetic boots clanking against the ramp as they deployed the portable shield generators to create a safe corridor. The xylophyte diplomats were huddled at the edge of the landing zone, their delicate, iridescent carapaces dulling under the film of volcanic dust. They looked like fragile sculptures placed in the middle of a blast furnace. Lead specialist Sarah Thorne reached the first diplomat and grabbed them by the shoulder, not with malice, but with a firm, uncompromising strength that brooked no argument. She didn't use a translator to explain the physics of their survival. She simply pointed toward the open more of the ship and pushed. The humans didn't treat the aliens as guests. They treated them as high-value cargo that needed to be moved from point A to point B before the environment reached a critical failure state. It was a logistical problem solved with muscle and reinforced steel. Sarah could see the fear in the diplomat's eyes, a confusion at being handled so roughly by a species that was supposed to be a Tier 3 auxiliary power. To the xylophytes, the humans were the galaxy's janitors, the ones who took the jobs too dirty or dangerous for the enlightened. But as the ground shuddered and a fresh fissure opened less than 50 meters from the ship, the janitors were the only ones standing between the xylophytes and a very hot, very permanent end. Inside the hold, the atmosphere was a chaotic mix of shouting, the hum of air scrubbers working at triple capacity, and the metallic clang of equipment being stowed. Vane watched from the observation deck as his crew worked with a synchronized efficiency that came from decades of surviving on the fringes of the sector. They didn't have the sophisticated AI-driven logistics of the central star systems. They had clipboards, grit, and a shared understanding that if one person slackened, everyone died. He saw a young technician named Marcus hauling a crate of medical supplies that should have required a powered exoskeleton, his face purple with the effort, his breath fogging the inside of his helmet. Marcus didn't complain, he just grunted and heaved the weight into the locking rack. This was the human way, to compensate for a lack of technological elegance with an abundance of sheer, stubborn will. The xylophytes, meanwhile, were attempting to organize themselves into a hierarchy based on their social castes, causing a bottleneck at the internal hatches. Vane keyed his comms, his voice booming over the ship's internal speakers. "Attention all passengers, this is not a gala on the Capitol spires. You will sit where the crew tells you, or you will be left to find your own way home." The clicking and chattering stopped instantly as the diplomats looked up, startled by the bluntness of the command. In their culture, tone was everything, and Vane's tone was that of a man who had reached the absolute limit of his patience. They began to shuffle into the designated seating areas, their movements frantic and uncoordinated compared to the steady, rhythmic pulse of the human crew. The ground tremor that followed was not a simple shake. It was a tectonic shift that tilted the Indomitable at a 20-degree angle. The magnetic anchors shrieked, the metal groaning under the lateral pressure as the bedrock beneath the starboard landing strut liquefied. Vane threw himself back into the pilot's seat, his fingers dancing across the manual override switches. He could see on the external monitors that the fissure was widening, swallowing the very ground they had just landed on. Sarah's voice crackled over the radio, urgent and sharp. "Commander, the ramp is jammed by a debris slide and the secondary strut is losing pressure. We need to go now or we're going to tip into the magma." Vane didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for the final head count or a signal from the orbital control. He slammed the emergency ignition, the 4 massive chemical rockets under the fuselage roaring to life with a violence that shook the entire ship to its core. The Indomitable didn't lift smoothly. It tore itself away from the ground, the magnetic anchors snapping like brittle twigs. The ship lurched, the tilt increasing as the engines fought to compensate for the uneven weight distribution. Inside the hold, the xylophytes were thrown against their restraints, their high-pitched whistles of distress lost in the thunder of the engines. Vane pulled back on the stick, feeling the sheer weight of the vessel fighting him, a physical struggle against the gravity of a dying moon. The hull temp spiked into the red, the cooling systems failing as the heat from the volcanic plume licked at the belly of the ship. They broke the atmosphere at an angle that would have sheared the wings off a more sophisticated craft, but the Indomitable was a blunt instrument designed to survive the impossible. As the blackness of space finally replaced the choking orange of the moon's sky, the vibrations settled into a low, steady hum. Vane leaned back, his flight suit soaked in sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked at the sensor display, which showed the moon below them literally tearing itself apart, the crust shattering into 1,000 glowing fragments. It was a beautiful, terrible sight, a reminder of how fragile life was in a universe governed by cold physics. Teethok unbuckled himself and floated toward Vane, his movements jerky and uncertain in the low gravity. The Xylophyte looked at the screens, then at Vane, his eyes reflecting the flickering lights of the console. "You stayed," Teethok said, the translator struggling to capture the nuance of his tone. The orbital scans said the probability of escape was less than 12%. Why did you stay when the math dictated a retreat? Vane didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on the navigation stars, his hands resting lightly on the controls. "Because we don't live by the math," Vane replied quietly. "We live by the fact that we don't leave people behind, even the ones who think we're just the help." Teethok was silent for a long time, a rare occurrence for his species. He seemed to be processing a concept that didn't fit into his neat, logical view of the cosmos. The human ship, scarred and battered, continued its slow trek toward the rendezvous point, a small spark of defiance in the vast, unyielding dark. As they approached the Xylophyte fleet, the contrast was jarring. The alien ships were works of art, flowing lines of translucent composite and glowing energy ribbons that looked more like bioluminescent sea creatures than interstellar vessels. They hung in the void with a stillness that suggested they were detached from the laws of motion. The Indomitable, by comparison, looked like a floating scrapyard, its hull scorched black, its landing gear dangling uselessly, and its engines venting a trail of dirty chemical exhaust. The Xylophyte flagship sent a communication request, the holographic projection appearing on Vane's bridge. A high-ranking official, draped in shimmering fabrics that denoted a status Vane couldn't begin to understand, looked at the human commander with a mixture of disdain and reluctant relief. "You have the diplomats," the official stated. It was a statement, not a question. Vane nodded, his jaw set. All of them, plus their staff, and about 3 tons of their records they insisted on bringing. "Your people are being processed in the medical bay now. They're a bit rattled, but they're alive." The official paused, his fingers twitching in a gesture of dismissal. "Very well. Transfer them to the shuttle bay. We will compensate your government for the fuel and the wear on your vessel as per the tertiary service agreement." The coldness of the response hit Vane like a physical blow, though he had expected nothing less. To them, this wasn't a heroic rescue, it was a service rendered by a low-order laborer. Vane watched the shuttles depart, the delicate Xylophyte craft flitting away from his ship like butterflies leaving a decaying log. He saw Sarah Thorne standing on the observation deck, watching them go. She had her helmet off, her hair matted with sweat and grease, a smudge of soot across her forehead. She looked exhausted, but there was a quiet pride in the way she stood, her feet planted firmly on the deck plates. Vane joined her, the two of them standing in silence as the Xylophyte fleet prepared to jump to hyperspace. "They didn't say thank you," Sarah remarked, her voice flat. "They never do," Vane replied. "They think we do this because we have to, because we're desperate for their technology or their favor. They don't understand that we do it because it's who we are. We are the ones who survive the things they won't even look at." He looked out at the stars, the distant pinpricks of light that represented 1,000 worlds they had yet to see, 1,000 dangers they had yet to face. The Xylophytes might have the beauty and the grace, but humanity had the iron. They had the ability to endure the friction of the universe and come out the other side, scarred but unbroken. The Indomitable began its slow turn away from the fleet, its engines coughing as they transitioned to cruise power. They were headed back to the edge of the sector, back to the mining outposts and the border colonies where the work was hard and the rewards were few. But as Vane looked at his crew, seeing the way they moved with a purpose that no alien could ever replicate, he knew they were the strongest thing in the galaxy. They didn't need the validation of the high-tier species. They had the cold, hard reality of their own survival. The ship moved forward, a dark shadow against the brilliance of the nebulae, carrying within it the fire of a species that refused to be extinguished. Every creak of the hull, every hiss of the life support, was a testament to their persistence. They were the ones who built the bridges, who cleared the debris, who stood in the gap when the sophisticated systems failed. They were the geometry of friction, the force that pushed back against the entropy of the universe. And as long as there was a world to save or a life to protect, the humans would be there, with their heavy boots and their unrefined iron, ready to face the storm. The Xylophyte fleet vanished into a fold of space, leaving the Indomitable alone in the quiet of the void, but Vane didn't feel lonely. He felt the pulse of the ship, the steady heartbeat of his crew, and the knowledge that they were exactly where they needed to be. The mission was over, but the work was never done. There were more fires to put out, more people to pull from the brink, and Vane Kestrel wouldn't have it any other way. The interior of the shipyard at Terminal Vane was a cavernous cathedral of industry, where the air tasted of ionized copper and the sweat of 10,000 laborers. It was a place where elegance went to die, replaced by the brutal efficiency of heavy-duty welding and the rhythmic thud of pneumatic presses. Commander Vane Kestrel stood on a precarious gantry overlooking the dry dock where the Indomitable was being stripped of its scorched hull plating. The damage from the volcanic moon was extensive, the structural ribs of the ship exposed like the bleached bones of a leviathan. Around the vessel, swarms of technicians in grease-stained coveralls moved with a frantic but coordinated energy, their plasma torches casting long, flickering shadows against the hangar walls. There were no automated repair drones here. The magnetic interference from the nearby gas giant made delicate electronics unreliable, so the work was done by human hands, guided by human eyes. Vane watched a team of structural engineers struggling with a massive slab of reinforced titanium, their faces obscured by tinted visors, their movements a testament to a lifetime of low-gravity labor. They didn't have the luxury of the gravitational stabilizers that the Xylophytes used to drift heavy loads. They used pulleys, levers, and the raw strength of their own backs. It was an ancient way of building, a heritage of grit that had followed humanity from the Terran cradle into the cold reaches of the Perseus arm. A woman approached him along the narrow walkway, her boots ringing out a sharp, metallic rhythm that cut through the ambient roar of the shipyard. This was Jace Thorne, Sarah's elder sibling, and the master of the dry dock, a person whose skin seemed to be permanently etched with the grime of the forge. She didn't offer a salute or a formal greeting. She simply spat a wad of stimulant resin into a disposal chute and leaned against the railing next to Vane. "She's a wreck," Jace said, her voice a low rasp that sounded like gravel being turned in a mixer. "You pushed the heat sinks past the melting point, scorched the primary conduits, and I'm pretty sure you warped the frame by 3 degrees on that emergency lift. It'll take a month just to get the seals airtight again." Vane didn't look away from his ship. He knew the cost of the rescue, and he knew that Jace was the only one who could actually fix the damage without charging the government a king's ransom. "We didn't have much of a choice, Jace," he replied, his voice tired. "The ground was turning into liquid glass. If we hadn't jumped when we did, we'd be part of the moon's geological record right now." Jace grunted, a sound of reluctant understanding. "I know why you did it, Kestrel. I just wish you'd bring her back in one piece for once. The Xylophytes sent over a data packet thanking us for the service, but they didn't include a single credit for the repairs. They claimed the damage was a result of our primitive propulsion systems rather than the environment." The unfairness of the statement didn't surprise Vane, but it still burned. The higher-tier species viewed human technology as a collection of dangerous toys, ignoring the fact that those toys were often the only things capable of operating in the high-stress zones the refined ships avoided. He watched as a crane lowered a new engine manifold into the bowels of the Indomitable, the massive component swinging precariously as the winds from the hangar's ventilation system caught it. The workers below didn't flinch. They caught the lead lines and guided the ton of metal into place with the practiced ease of men who lived on the edge of catastrophe. It was this refusal to be intimidated by scale or danger that defined the human presence in the sector. They were the ones who built the stations in the radiation belts, who mined the asteroids that were too unstable for robotic probes, and who maintained the relay stations in the lightless voids between stars. They were the muscle of the galaxy, the unacknowledged foundation upon which the more delicate civilizations rested. Vane turned to Jace, his eyes narrowing. "How long until she can fly? I don't need her pretty, I just need her space-worthy." Jace looked at the ship, her expression softening just a fraction. 2 weeks if I double the shifts. "But you're going to owe me more than just a drink this time, Kestrel. You're going to owe me a miracle." The miracle came sooner than expected, though not in the form Jace had hoped for. 3 days into the repairs, the shipyard's emergency klaxons began to wail, a dissonant, piercing shriek that signaled an unscheduled arrival in the local space. Vane was in the mess hall, staring at a lukewarm cup of synthetic coffee when the lights flickered and dimmed. He was on his feet before the second pulse hit, his instincts honed by years of orbital combat. He ran for the bridge of the Indomitable, which was still a skeletal mess of exposed wiring and temporary scaffolding. From the viewport, he could see a rift opening in the blackness of the system's edge. It wasn't the clean, shimmering fold of a xylophyte jump. It was a jagged, bleeding tear in reality, a signature of the Void Walkers. The Void Walkers were a nomadic, predatory species that existed on the fringes of known space, moving in massive, city-sized hulks that were more organic than mechanical. They didn't negotiate, and they didn't trade. They simply consumed resources and moved on, leaving nothing but cold husks in their wake. The xylophytes and the other high-tier species usually stayed well clear of Void Walker territory, relying on their superior speed to outrun the threat. But Terminal Vane was a stationary target, a hub of human industry that was currently defenseless. Vane scrambled up the maintenance ladder to the ship's temporary command center, his mind racing through the tactical possibilities. The shipyard had a few point defense turrets, but they were designed to stop debris and small-scale pirates, not a Void Walker harvester. He keyed into the station-wide comms, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "This is Commander Kestrel to all station personnel. We have a Tier 5 threat on the horizon. Jace, I need power to the Indomitable's main batteries now. I don't care if the conduits are exposed, just give me a spark." Jace's voice came back through the static, frantic, and breathless. "The engines aren't even mounted yet, Kestrel. If you fire those batteries, you'll blow the dry dock apart." Vane looked at the incoming harvester, a gargantuan mass of dark matter and pulsing purple light that was already deploying its tendrils toward the station's fuel depots. "Then we'll blow it apart together," he said. "Better to die fighting than to be harvested like cattle." He saw Sarah Thorne on the hangar floor, directing the evacuation of the civilian workers. She looked up at the bridge, her eyes meeting Vane's for a brief second. There was no fear in her gaze, only a grim determination. She knew the stakes, and she knew what had to be done. The first volley from the harvester struck the station's outer ring, a beam of concentrated entropy that turned reinforced steel into brittle dust. The station shuddered, the gravitational stabilizers failing as the air began to hiss out of a dozen hull breaches. Vane felt the Indomitable groan as the dry dock shifted, the ship straining against its remaining tethers. He gripped the edges of the command console, his knuckles white. On his screen, he saw the power levels in the ship's primary capacitors beginning to climb, fueled by the station's emergency reactors. Jace was doing it. She was bypassing every safety protocol in the book to give him a weapon. The energy hummed through the deck plates, a low-frequency vibration that made Vane's teeth ache. The harvester was closing the distance, its massive maw opening to reveal a swirling vortex of energy that would soon begin to strip the station's atmosphere. Vane waited, his finger hovering over the fire control. He needed the harvester to be close enough that the Indomitable's uncalibrated beams wouldn't miss. He needed the enemy to feel the heat of human defiance. Now, Vane screamed, slamming his hand down on the console. The Indomitable erupted with a fury that defied its broken state. Two massive beams of raw, unfiltered thermal energy lanced out from the ship's forward mounts, cutting through the shipyard's atmosphere and striking the harvester's lead tendril. The recoil was immense, throwing Vane against the back bulkhead and snapping several of the ship's remaining moorings. The dry dock was filled with a blinding white light as the beams tore through the Void Walker's shielding, the heat so intense that the nearby hangar walls began to sag and melt. The harvester recoiled, its organic hull blackening and sloughing off in great, steaming chunks. It hadn't expected a fight, and certainly not from a ship that was currently undergoing a total overhaul. The station continued to rock, the sound of tearing metal filling the air as the Indomitable began to slide out of its cradle, half guided by its own thrusters and half driven by the sheer force of its own weapons' fire. In the chaos, Vane managed to claw his way back to the controls. The harvester was wounded, but it was far from dead. It began to turn its massive bulk toward the Indomitable, its remaining tendrils glowing with a malevolent light. Vane knew they couldn't survive a direct hit. He looked at the ship's diagnostics. The power conduits were melting, and the primary reactor was minutes away from a catastrophic meltdown. He opened a channel to the entire shipyard. Everyone into the reinforced bunkers. Jace, get your team out of there. We're going to shove this thing back into the dark. He didn't wait for a response. He pushed the thrusters to their absolute limit, the Indomitable lurching forward like a wounded beast. The ship was no longer a vessel. It was a kinetic slug, 100,000 tons of steel and intent hurtling toward the center of the harvester's mass. Vane felt the impact not as a sound, but as a total cessation of movement. The world turned white, then black, as the Indomitable buried its prow into the soft, pulsating flesh of the Void Walker. When Vane opened his eyes, the world was silent and cold. He was floating in the ruins of the bridge, his suit's emergency lights the only source of illumination. Through the shattered viewport, he could see the remains of the harvester, its core shattered, its dark energy dissipating into the void like smoke. The Indomitable was embedded in the wreckage, a tomb of iron and grit. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Sarah, her helmet cracked, her face streaked with blood. "We did it," she whispered, her voice echoing in the small space. "We stopped it." Vane looked out at the station, which was battered and broken but still standing. He saw the rescue shuttles already moving out to pick up the survivors, their lights blinking in the dark. He felt a strange sense of peace. They had lost the ship, and they had nearly lost their lives, but they had proven something that the Xylophytes would never understand. Endurance wasn't about having the best technology or the most elegant solutions. It was about what you were willing to sacrifice when the darkness came knocking. It was about the architecture of a species that refused to break, no matter the pressure. Vane reached out and took Sarah's hand, the two of them watching as the sun of the system rose over the edge of the wreckage, casting a golden light over the ruins of their victory. They were humans, and they were still here. The debris field of the shattered harvester was a labyrinth of frozen ichor and twisted alloy, a silent graveyard that the human survivors had to navigate with nothing but thruster packs and handheld cutting torches. Vane Kestrel floated in the hollowed-out remains of what had once been the Indomitable's tactical suite, his breathing rhythmic and shallow to conserve the dwindling oxygen in his suit. The silence of the void was absolute, a heavy pressure that seemed to push against the glass of his visor, yet his mind was filled with the phantom echoes of the ship's final scream. They had won, but the victory felt as hollow as the wreckage surrounding him. The station, Terminal Vane, was a jagged silhouette against the distant star, its rotating rings stuttering as the remaining internal gyroscopes fought against the structural imbalances caused by the Voidwalkers' assault. Humanity's footprint in this sector had always been light, a precarious existence on the edge of more powerful empires, and now that footprint was being slowly erased by the reality of attrition. Vane pushed off a floating bulkhead, drifting toward the jagged hole where the main viewport had once been, watching the flickering lights of the salvage teams as they moved like fireflies across the dark mass of the dead harvester. Sarah Thorne was already there, her magnetic boots locked onto a piece of the harvester's internal carapace, her suit's external speakers broadcasting a low-frequency hum to test the density of the alien material. She looked up as Vane drifted near, her face a pale ghost behind the reinforced polycarbonate of her helmet. "We found the core," she said, her voice crackling with the interference of the local radiation. "It's not just an engine, Vane. It's a repository. The Xylophytes and the others, they always said the Voidwalkers were just mindless predators, but this thing was carrying data crystals from 3 different fallen civilizations. They aren't just eating ships, they're harvesting histories." Vane landed beside her, the vibration of his boots hitting the alien hull sending a shiver up his spine. "The Xylophytes would pay a fortune for those crystals," he remarked, though his tone was devoid of any real interest in the profit. "They'd use them to fill their museums and write their papers while we sit here in the dark trying to weld our lives back together." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She was looking at the station, where the first of the heavy freighters from the inner colonies was finally arriving to provide relief. The arrival of the inner colony ships was not the celebratory event Vane had hoped for. These were the vessels of the corporate syndicates, sleek and functional, but devoid of the soul that characterized the frontier ships. They didn't come with open hands, they came with contracts. The lead negotiator, a man whose skin had been smoothed by expensive regenerative treatments until he looked like a wax mannequin, met Vane in the station's remaining pressurized observation lounge. He didn't look at the scars on Vane's face or the way the commander's hands still twitched from the neural feedback of the ship's destruction. He looked at a holographic ledger. "You've caused a significant disruption to the local trade routes, Commander Kestrel," the man said, his voice as polished as his appearance. "The destruction of a Tier 5 harvester is a notable feat, certainly, but the environmental impact on the shipyard and the loss of the Indomitable's cargo capacity has put us behind schedule. We are prepared to offer a reconstruction loan, but the interest will be tied to the mineral output of the nearby belt for the next 50 years. Vane felt a slow, cold anger beginning to coil in his gut, a heat that was more dangerous than the fire of a reactor. "We saved the station," Vane said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "We saved your precious trade routes from being turned into a buffet for a Void Walker, and you want to talk to me about mineral output?" The negotiator didn't blink. "Survival is a commodity like any other, Commander. You chose to engage the enemy. You chose to sacrifice your vessel. Those were tactical decisions made outside of syndicate oversight. We are simply here to manage the aftermath." Vane stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the deck plates. The sound was a violation of the quiet, sterile atmosphere of the lounge. He leaned over the table, his shadow falling across the negotiator's pristine holographic displays. "You think you're managing the aftermath, but you're just picking over the bones. My crew didn't bleed so you could balance a checkbook. We did what had to be done because there was no one else to do it." The negotiator finally looked up, a flicker of something like pity in his eyes. "That is the tragedy of your kind, Kestrel. You are so busy being heroes that you forget the universe is built on math, not sentiment. You are a species of outliers, and outliers are eventually corrected by the mean. Vane walked out of the lounge and headed for the lower docks, where Jace Thorne was overseeing the stripping of the harvester's core. The air here was thick with the smell of ozone and the rhythmic clatter of heavy machinery. Jace was standing on a floating platform, her hands deep in the guts of an alien power coupling, her face smeared with a dark, iridescent fluid that looked like liquid starlight. She looked at Vane and knew immediately how the meeting had gone. "The suits want their pound of flesh, don't they?" she asked, not looking up from her work. Vane nodded, leaning against a support pillar. 50 years of indentured mining for the whole sector. They're calling it a reconstruction loan. Jace let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Of course they are. They wait for us to do the heavy lifting, wait for us to break our toys, and then they come in to buy the pieces for a discount. But they missed something, Vane. She pulled a crystalline shard from the coupling, its surface pulsing with a soft, rhythmic light. This isn't just data. It's a map. It's a directory of every refueling point and hidden cache the Voidwalkers have used for the last 1,000 years. The realization hit Vane with the force of a physical blow. If they had a map of the Voidwalker routes, they didn't need the Syndicate's protection or their trade routes. They could find the resources themselves, out in the deep black where the corporations were too afraid to go. But it was more than that. It was a way to stop being the galaxy's janitors and start being its pathfinders. "We can't give this to the Xylophytes," Vane whispered, his mind already racing through the implications. "And we definitely can't give it to the Syndicate." Jace wiped her hands on a rag, her expression turning somber. "If we keep it, we're on our own, truly on our own. No more relief ships, no more orbital support, just us and the dark." Vane looked at the shard, then out at the stars through the hangar's open magnetic field. "We've always been on our own, Jace. They just let us believe otherwise as long as we were useful. It's time we started being useful to ourselves." The decision was made in the quiet of the night, away from the prying eyes of the station's sensors. Vane gathered the survivors of the Indomitable in the ruins of the ship's mess hall. There were only 40 of them left, men and women who had looked into the maw of a god-killer and hadn't blinked. He told them about the shard, the map, and the price of the Syndicate's help. He didn't sugarcoat the reality. He told them they would be outlaws in their own sector, scavengers in a void that didn't want them. "We have a choice," Vane told them, his voice echoing in the small space. "We can sign their papers and spend the rest of our lives digging rocks for people who wouldn't walk across a room to save us, or we can take what we've found and find a new way. It won't be easy and it won't be safe, but it will be ours." He looked at Sarah, at Marcus, at the young technicians who had grown old in a single afternoon of combat. One by one, they stood up. There were no cheers, no speeches. There was only the sound of 40 pairs of boots hitting the deck in unison. The theft of the heavy-lift frigate Aegis from the Syndicate's mooring was a masterpiece of human improvisation. They didn't use hacking codes or stealth fields. They used a diversion involving a simulated reactor leak and a series of well-placed explosive bolts. By the time the Syndicate security teams realized the Aegis was moving, the ship was already clearing the station's gravity well, its engines burning a dirty, desperate orange. Vane was back in a pilot's seat, the familiar weight of the controls, a comfort against the uncertainty of their future. Behind them, Terminal Vane was a receding spark, a home they were leaving behind to save its soul. The Syndicate would send hunters, and the Xylophytes would eventually realize what had been taken from the Harvester's core, but for now, the vacuum was wide and welcoming. As the Aegis transitioned into the first jump, guided by the pulsing light of the Voidwalker shard, Vane looked at the readouts. The calculus of sacrifice was a brutal thing, a constant weighing of lives against progress, of safety against freedom. They had sacrificed their standing, their homes, and their security. But as the ship slipped into the fold of space, leaving the known world behind, Vane felt a sense of clarity he hadn't known in years. They were no longer the help. They were no longer the outliers being corrected by the mean. They were the ones who moved the needle. They were the architects of their own endurance, and the galaxy was finally beginning to realize that you couldn't calculate the worth of a species that was willing to throw the math away. The journey was just beginning, and the dark was full of secrets, but for the first time, humanity wasn't waiting for permission to find them. They were simply going, and they were bringing the iron with them. The transition into the untracked sectors of the Perseus Veil was like plunging a red-hot needle into a pool of liquid nitrogen. The Aegis was a sturdy vessel, but it had never been intended for the jagged, non-linear jump paths dictated by the Voidwalker shard. In the cockpit, Vane Kestrel watched the navigation sensors blur into a chaotic smear of ultraviolet ghosts and gravimetric shadows. The shard sat in a makeshift housing atop the primary console, pulsing with a rhythmic, sickly violet light that seemed to beat in time with the ship's own reactor. Every few seconds, the light would flare, and the Aegis would lurch violently as the spatial stabilizers fought to interpret coordinates that defied conventional Euclidean geometry. To the xylophytes, space was a highway to be navigated with precision and grace. To the humans aboard the Aegis, it had become a dark forest where they were navigating by the scent of ozone and the feeling of a cold wind against their necks. Vane's vision swam with the strain of manual oversight, his fingers hovering over the abort switch, but he knew there was no going back. The Syndicate's pursuit frigates were likely already scouring the jump gate at Terminal Vane, finding nothing but the cooling wake of a ship that had vanished into a region of space designated as a navigational dead zone for the last 4 centuries. Sarah Thorne stood behind him, her hands braced against the back of his seat, her eyes fixed on the shifting data streams. She had spent the last 48 hours trying to translate the frequency of the shard's pulses into something a human pilot could understand, and the exhaustion was etched into the dark circles beneath her eyes. "The shard isn't just a map, Vane," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the screaming whine of the jump engines. "It's a sensory organ. It's looking for something. Every time we pass a gravitational anomaly, the pulse stabilizes. It's leading us to a graveyard." Vane didn't ask her to clarify, he could feel it too. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of being watched by the very vacuum that surrounded them. The Aegis suddenly shuddered, as if it had struck a physical wall, the inertial dampeners shrieking in protest as the ship was forcibly pulled out of the jump. The white light of the fold space vanished, replaced by a sight that caused Vane's heart to skip a beat. They were floating in the center of a massive, silent nebula, the gas clouds glowing with a dim, phosphorescent green that illuminated thousands of derelict hulls. It was a field of wreckage that stretched for light years in every direction, a silent monument to every ship the Voidwalkers had ever claimed. There were xylophyte cruisers, their once elegant spires broken and drifting. There were heavy cargo haulers from civilizations that hadn't been seen in the galaxy for a millennium. And there were thousands of smaller, unidentifiable craft, all clustered together like a reef of dead coral. The scale of the loss was staggering, a physical representation of the calculus of sacrifice that Vane had been contemplating since the battle at the shipyard. The Aegis moved through the debris at a crawl, its sensor pings echoing back from the cold metal of the ghosts. "This isn't just a graveyard," Marcus said from the engineering station, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and terror. "Look at the energy readings. The hulls are being held together by some kind of low-level electrostatic field. They aren't just drifting, they're being stored." Vane looked at the shard, which had gone from a frantic pulse to a steady, unwavering glow. It was pointing toward the center of the mass, where the nebula was thickest. As they moved deeper into the wreckage, the debris began to take on a more organized structure. The larger ships were arranged in concentric circles, their bows pointed inward toward a central point. It looked like a ritual or a machine. Vane could see that the Voidwalkers hadn't just destroyed these ships. They had stripped them of their engines, their life support, and their computers, leaving only the structural shells. It was a harvest of history, as Sarah had suspected, but to what end? The answer became clear when they cleared the final ring of debris. In the heart of the nebula sat a structure that defied description. It was a sphere of dark matter, miles across, its surface rippling with the same purple energy they had seen on the Harvester. Thousands of thin, umbilical-like cables extended from the sphere, connecting to the surrounding derelicts. It was a library, a massive, organic archive that was literally feeding on the residual data and memories trapped within the metal of the fallen ships. The shard in Vane's cockpit began to vibrate so intensely that the glass housing cracked, a high-pitched hum filling the bridge. "We shouldn't be here," Jace's voice came over the comms from the lower decks, sharp and panicked. "Vane, the reactor is starting to sync with that thing. It's pulling power from us. If we stay in this proximity, we're going to be integrated into the network." Vane reached for the thruster controls, but they were dead. The Aegis was caught in a tractor beam of pure information, a pull that wasn't physical but conceptual. On the screens, the ship's own logs began to scroll at a blinding speed, their history being extracted by the sphere. He saw the records of the Indomitable, the faces of the crew they had lost, the technical specifications of their primitive iron-based technology. The sphere was learning them. It was taking everything they were and adding it to the archive of the dead. Sarah lunged for the shard, her intention to smash it, but Vane caught her arm. "No," he shouted. "If it wants our story, we give it to it, but we give it the parts it can't digest." He looked at the console, at the manual override for the ship's communication array. "Sarah, help Marcus patch the bridge audio directly into the transmission output," he commanded. "Every recording we have, every personal log, every bit of unfiltered human experience. Don't send the data packets, send the noise." They understood immediately. They didn't send the clean, mathematical language of the higher-tier species. They sent the sounds of the shipyard, the shouting of the crew during the breach, the laughter in the mess hall after a long shift, and the raw, unrefined sounds of human struggle. They sent the sound of a species that didn't fit into a neat, archival sphere. The Aegis roared with the force of the transmission, the speakers on the bridge blowing out as the raw audio data flooded the sphere's intake. The effect was instantaneous. The sphere's surface began to churn violently, the purple light flickering and turning a chaotic, muddy gray. The Voidwalker archive was built on the logic of consumption, on the orderly storage of facts and figures. It couldn't handle the irrational, the emotional, or the sheer friction of human existence. The umbilical cables began to snap, the derelicts drifting away as the sphere's internal logic collapsed under the weight of the human noise. The Aegis was violently repelled, the ship spinning away from the center of the nebula as the tractor beam inverted. Vane fought the controls, the manual hydraulics groaning as he wrestled the ship back onto a stable heading. Behind them, the sphere was imploding, the dark matter folding in on itself as the archive purged the incompatible data. The green nebula flared with a final, brilliant light before being swallowed by the collapsing core. As the shockwave hit, Vane slammed the ship back into jump, the shard finally shattering into 1,000 pieces of dull, inert glass. They didn't know where they were going, but they knew they were leaving the ghosts behind. When they finally emerged in the quiet of open space, the Aegis was a wreck. The electronics were fried, the hull was pitted by the nebula's corrosive gas, and the crew was shaken to their core. But as Vane looked at his hands, he saw that they were steady. They had faced the memory of the entire galaxy and had survived because they were the only ones who weren't afraid of being messy. Sarah sat on the floor of the bridge, surrounded by the shards of the broken map, her head in her hands. "It's gone," she said, her voice trembling. "The map, the archive, all that history. We destroyed it." Vane walked over and knelt beside her, picking up a piece of the dead glass. We didn't destroy it, Sarah. We just proved that some things aren't meant to be stored in a box. We're not meant to be a record. We're meant to be a force. He looked at the stars, which seemed brighter now that the shadow of the archive was gone. They were still outlaws, and they were still alone, but they had found the one thing the Voidwalkers and the Xylophytes could never understand, the power of the unrefined. They weren't ghosts yet, and as long as they kept making noise, the universe would have to listen. The return to the fringe was not a quiet affair. The Aegis limped into the orbit of the mining colony at Sealam's Reach like a wounded predator, dragging its broken limbs back to a familiar cave. The colony was a sprawl of pressurized domes and industrial scaffolding clinging to the side of a massive, iron-rich asteroid, a place where the lore of the central systems was a distant rumor, and the only thing that mattered was the purity of the ore. Vane Kestrel watched the docking clamps engage from the remains of the bridge, the metallic thud of the locks echoing through the ship's skeletal frame. They were low on air, lower on fuel, and the crew had been living on emergency rations for weeks, but as the airlock cycled open, they were met not with the sterile indifference of the syndicate, but with the roar of 1,000 voices. Word of the Indomitables stand at Terminal Vane, and the subsequent theft of the Aegis had spread through the frontier like a wildfire in an oxygen-rich environment. To the miners, the mechanics, and the outcasts of the Perseus arm, Vane and his crew were no longer just laborers. They were the first spark of a rebellion that had been brewing for centuries in the dark. Vane stepped onto the colony's primary concourse, his boots heavy with the weight of exhaustion and the responsibility he had never asked for. He was met by a delegation of union leaders, men and women with faces like hammered copper and hands scarred by radiation burns. These were the people who kept the galaxy running, the ones who harvested the raw materials that built the Xylophyte spires and the syndicate banks, and they were tired of being the fuel for someone else's engine. The lead representative, a towering woman named Ilara, who had lost an eye to a pressure suit failure, stepped forward and gripped Vane's forearm in a traditional miner's greeting. "You've caused a lot of trouble, Commander," she said, a slow, grim smile spreading across her weathered face. "The Syndicate has put a bounty on your head that could buy a moon, and the Xylophytes are calling you a cosmic vandal for what you did to the archive. But down here, we call it a start. We've been waiting for someone to prove that the heavy metal ships could still bite." Vane looked around the concourse, seeing the hundreds of people watching him with a hope that felt more dangerous than any Voidwalker beam. The situation was far more precarious than the cheering crowds suggested. The Syndicate had declared a total blockade of the fringe colonies, cutting off the supply of refined medicines and advanced electronics that the humans couldn't produce themselves. It was an attempt to starve the rebellion before it could find its feet, a calculated move to remind the frontier that while they provided the raw iron, the central systems provided the civilization. Vane met with the colony leaders in a cramped, humid machine shop that served as their command center. "We can't win a war of attrition," Vane said, pointing to a holographic map of the local cluster. "The Syndicate has the numbers, and the Xylophytes have the technology. If we stay here and wait for them to come to us, they'll just sit in high orbit and watch us suffocate. We need to hit them where it hurts, not in their wallets, but in their sense of superiority. We need to show them that their refined world is built on a foundation of our unrefined grit." Jace Thorne stepped forward, tossing a handful of sensors onto the table. "They're coming for us, Vane. I've picked up the signature of a Syndicate task force jumping into the neighboring system. They're not coming for a conversation, they're bringing orbital bombardment platforms. They want to make an example of Sealam's Reach." Sarah Thorne, who had been quiet since their escape from the nebula, looked up from her notes. "The archive we destroyed. It wasn't just memories. I've been analyzing the residual data we captured before the sphere imploded. The Voidwalkers weren't just storing history, they were using it to calibrate their weapons. Every ship they harvested gave them the frequency of its hull resonance. That's how they could cut through shields like they weren't there. But it works both ways. If we know the resonance of the Syndicate's alloys, we can make our kinetic slugs bypass their energy fields. We don't need lasers or plasma. We just need to hit them with the right kind of iron at the right frequency. The plan was a masterclass in human desperation and engineering brilliance. For 5 days, the colony's forges worked at a fever pitch, casting massive, unrefined iron slugs that were etched with the specific harmonic pattern Sarah had extracted from the archive's data. They weren't building elegant missiles. They were building a massive, railgun-style defense system out of the asteroid's own structure. They hollowed out the core of Sealam's Reach, turning the entire celestial body into a barrel for a weapon of unprecedented scale. The humans didn't have the stabilizers or the AI targeting systems of the inner systems, so they did it manually. They used the same pulleys and levers they used for mining, the same sweat and muscle that had built their homes in the dark. They were literally turning their sanctuary into a gun. Vane watched the work, feeling a profound sense of pride. This was the metallurgy of defiance, taking the very ground they stood on and turning it into a middle finger pointed at the stars. The Syndicate fleet arrived on the 6th day, a phalanx of silver, needle-shaped ships that looked like jewelry against the black of space. They didn't even bother with a broadcast. They simply moved into firing position, their primary batteries glowing with the blue light of ionized gas. Vane was in the control center of the asteroid, his hand on the manual trigger of the massive railgun. He could feel the vibration of the asteroid's core as the capacitors, powered by the colony's entire energy grid, began to hum. He waited until the lead Syndicate ship, a dreadnought named the Arbitration, began to charge its orbital beams. Now, Vane whispered. He didn't just pull the trigger, he felt the entire weight of the asteroid kick as the first iron slug was launched at a significant fraction of the speed of light. The recoil shattered the lower levels of the docking bays, but the result was spectacular. The iron slug didn't explode against the Arbitration's shields. It passed through them as if they didn't exist, the harmonic etching on the slug's surface neutralizing the energy field in a microsecond of interference. The slug buried itself in the dreadnought's bow and exited through the stern, leaving a clean, glowing hole through the center of the ship. The Arbitration didn't shatter, it simply lost all power, its internal atmosphere venting into the void as the structural integrity failed. The rest of the Syndicate fleet, seeing their flagship disabled by a piece of raw ore, hesitated. It was a mistake they wouldn't get to make twice. 2 more slugs lanced out from Sealam's Reach, guided by the manual calculations of a dozen miners who spent their lives judging the trajectory of falling rocks. A second cruiser was sheared in half, and a third was sent spinning into the gravity well of the nearby gas giant. The Syndicate fleet retreated, their elegant ships fleeing from the silent, deadly rocks of the humans. They had come to collect a debt, and they had been paid in the only currency the frontier had left, raw, unyielding iron. As the sirens in the colony transitioned from alarms to victory peals, Vane Kestrel sat back in his chair, his body trembling with the release of tension. They hadn't just won a battle, they had changed the rules of the game. They had proven that the gap between the refined and the unrefined was not a matter of quality, but of perspective. The high-tier species relied on their technology to insulate them from the universe, but the humans lived in the friction of it. Sarah walked over to him, her face lit by the glowing readouts of the successful hits. "We've done it, Vane. They won't come back with ships like those. Next time they'll bring everything they have." Vane nodded, looking out at the retreating lights of the Syndicate. "Let them come," he said. "We have a lot more rocks." The aftermath of the defense of Sealam's Reach was a period of intense, focused labor. The message had been sent, but the revolution was only just beginning. Other colonies, hearing of the victory, began to send their own ships, forming a ragtag fleet of miners, traders, and scavengers. They were the ones who had been ignored, the ones who had been treated as the background noise of the galaxy. Now, they were the main event. Vane looked at the growing assembly of ships outside the asteroid, each one a testament to human endurance and ingenuity. They were the metallurgy of defiance, a collective of souls who had decided that their worth was not something to be negotiated, but something to be forged. The path ahead was dark and full of fire, but for the first time in his life, Vane Kestrel felt like they were the ones holding the hammer. The galaxy was about to find out exactly what happens when you push the people who build the world too far. The final confrontation did not take place in the gleaming heart of the central systems, nor did it occur within the shifting mists of a nebula. It unfolded at the breach point, a massive gravitational well where the primary trade routes converged like the spokes of a wheel. This was the throat of the sector, the singular point through which all wealth and influence flowed, and it was here that the Syndicate and the Xylophite hegemony had combined their forces to finally excise the human infection from the body of the galaxy. Vane Kestrel stood on the bridge of his new flagship, a resurrected and heavily modified dreadnought they had christened the Unrefined. It was a monstrosity of engineering, a patchwork of 3 different hull designs welded together with high-tensile industrial plating and powered by a core they had scavenged from a fallen Voidwalker harvester. The ship didn't glow with the soft luminescence of alien technology. It pulsed with a deep, subsonic thrum that vibrated in the teeth of everyone on board. Around him, the human fleet was a chaotic array of mining barges, converted freighters, and long-range scouts, each one bristling with the harmonic kinetic launchers they had perfected at Sealam's reach. They were outnumbered 10-1, facing a wall of silver and light that stretched from one side of the sensor array to the other, but the humans had one advantage the higher-tier species could never quantify. They were comfortable with the prospect of losing everything. Vane looked at the holographic display, which showed the enemy fleet beginning to form a perfect geometric blockade. The Xylophite flagship, a translucent spire of crystalline energy, broadcast a wide-spectrum transmission that filled the bridge with the sound of clicking mandibles and synthesized resonance. "Commander Kestrel," the voice began, its tone one of clinical disappointment rather than anger. "Your species has demonstrated a remarkable capacity for localized disruption, but you are a statistical impossibility in the long term. You lack the refinement to sustain a civilization and the logic to recognize your own obsolescence. Surrender your vessels and your leadership, and we will permit the remaining colonies to exist under a supervised administrative mandate. Fail to do so, and we will be forced to apply the final correction." Vane didn't look at the screen. He looked at Jace and Sarah, who were stationed at the tactical and engineering consoles. They didn't need a speech. They didn't need an anthem. They just needed him to give the word. "We're not interested in your math," Vane said, his voice broadcast back to the entire combined fleet. "And we're definitely not interested in your permission to exist. We've been building your ships, mining your fuels, and cleaning up your messes for 300 years. You think we're a correction that needs to be made? We are the ones who hold the pencil." He turned to Sarah. "Trigger the resonance pulse." The Unrefined didn't fire a weapon. It released a massive, low-frequency wave of gravitational interference that they had tuned to the exact frequency of the Xylophite energy grids. The effect was like a hammer striking a glass cathedral. The elegant shields of the alien fleet didn't just fail, they shattered into a million fragments of useless light, leaving the silver ships of the Syndicate exposed and vulnerable. The humans didn't hesitate. They didn't engage in tactical maneuvers or long-range duels. They charged. The Battle of the Breach Point was a visceral, brutal demonstration of the geometry of friction. The human ships moved in tight, overlapping formations, using their heavy iron plating to absorb the incoming fire that would have vaporized a more delicate vessel. They got in close, where the Syndicate's long-range batteries were useless, and they fired their harmonic slugs directly into the enemy's hulls. Vane steered the unrefined into the thickest part of the xylophyte formation, the ship's prow acting like a battering ram. He felt the impact of every collision, the sound of tearing metal filling the bridge as they literally shredded the crystalline spires of the hegemony. This wasn't a war of attrition, it was a war of physical intent. The xylophytes, used to the detached elegance of energy-based combat, panicked as their ships were boarded by human teams using plasma torches and primitive chemical explosives to sabotage internal systems. The humans fought like they lived, with a relentless, grinding persistence that ignored the odds in favor of the immediate goal. In the center of the chaos, the unrefined squared off against the xylophyte flagship. The alien vessel tried to use its superior speed to outmaneuver the human dreadnought, but Vane had anticipated the move. He didn't try to chase them. He used the ship's primary gravity anchors to tether the unrefined to the xylophyte spire, dragging both ships into a violent, spinning embrace. The stresses on the human hull were immense, the metal groaning and bucking as the two massive structures fought for dominance. Jace, vent the reactor coolant into the forward thrusters. Vane shouted over the roar of the failing systems. "We are going to push them into the gravity well." Jace didn't question the order. She bypassed the safety locks, and the unrefined became a torch of white-hot gas, the force of the venting coolant shoving both ships toward the event horizon of the breach point. The xylophytes tried to disengage, their thrusters screaming in a frequency of pure terror, but the human anchors held fast. It was a suicide pact that only one side was willing to fulfill. As they reached the edge of the gravitational collapse, Vane saw the xylophyte flagship begin to fracture, its crystalline structure unable to handle the sheer, raw pressure of the well. The human ship, built of reinforced iron and stubbornness, held together for just a few seconds longer. That was all they needed. Vane triggered the emergency separation, the explosive bolts firing with a sound like a thunderclap. The unrefined was kicked back by the force of the blast, spinning away from the abyss, while the xylophyte flagship was swallowed by the darkness, its refined beauty crushed into a single point of infinite density. The rest of the combined fleet, seeing their command structure literally erased from existence, broke and fled. The syndicate ships jumped to hyperspace in a disorganized scramble, and the remaining xylophytes drifted aimlessly, their systems paralyzed by the loss of their primary resonance. The humans had won, not through superior technology, but through the willingness to endure the weight of their own actions. The unrefined was a drifting ruin, its engines cold and its hull glowing with the heat of the struggle, but it was still there. Vane sat in the darkened bridge, the emergency lights casting long, flickering shadows over the faces of his crew. They were battered, bleeding and exhausted, but they were alive. Sarah walked over to him, her movements slow and heavy. "They're gone, Vane," she whispered. "The blockade is broken. The trade routes are open for us." Vane looked out the shattered viewport at the stars, which no longer felt like a distant, indifferent audience. They felt like home. He knew the galaxy would never be the same. The high-tier species would have to learn to live with a neighbor they couldn't control, a species that didn't follow the math and didn't fear the dark. They would have to learn to respect the iron. In the years that followed, the humans didn't build spires of glass or empires of light. They built stations that could withstand a supernova and ships that could navigate the heart of a nebula. They became the explorers of the sectors the others were too afraid to touch, the ones who mapped the ghosts and tamed the friction. Vane Kestrel eventually retired to a small colony on the edge of the Perseus Arm, a place where the air was thick and the work was hard. He didn't want a monument or a title. He just wanted to hear the sound of a hammer hitting an anvil. He would often sit outside his dome and watch the heavy freighters rise into the sky, their engines burning with a steady orange light. They weren't elegant and they weren't quiet, but they were theirs. And as he watched the stars, he knew that as long as there was someone willing to stand in the gap, someone willing to be the unrefined edge of the universe, humanity would never be corrected. They were the gravity of their own intent, and the galaxy was finally, beautifully, in balance.